Welcome to On the Block with Andrew Gurvich, a podcast about authentic people doing beautiful things. Enjoy the show.
Well, hello, On the Blockers. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Glad to be with you. It's been a few months since we have last been together. As I told you the last time we spoke during the Rabbi Joel Bass episode, the future of the show is uncertain. We've been making this show for close to 2 years now, and when we started, we had this vision to make a show about transformation. We saw the planet, like many of you have, and our culture entering a phase of uncertainty and radical and perhaps violent transformation, and we wanted to make a program that laid some groundwork out for a dialogue between folks of various backgrounds to try to find a way to come together, to try to find a way to map out routes to one another in this increasingly bifurcated and propagandized world. We are experiencing transfiguration. Since we last spoke, my beautiful state of Oregon is on fire. We have insane and historic wildfires across the state and across the region, raging through parts of California, Oregon, Washington, Vancouver, British Columbia, Idaho, Montana. We've had several Category 3, 4, 5, and even 6 hurricanes moving through Texas, moving through Florida. It's been a real wild ride as we've moved into 2017, and I think a lot of us are sensing in ourselves that this concept of apocalypse is upon us. When I was an evangelical pastor for a lot of years, I've spoken about this on the show before. One of the things the New Testament says is that the end of the world will arrive like a thief in the night and catch us all off guard. And regardless of the kind of stock you put into those ancient texts, I think that's one that the Bible might have gotten a little bit wrong. It seems like the end of the world is marching down the middle of Main Street with a big ugly band and parade, and we all sit by sort of helpless, wondering what to do about it, if anything. And we've broken more than ever along racial lines. We've broken more than ever along gendered lines. We've broken more than ever along socioeconomic lines. And there's not many of us out there trying to do the hard work, or maybe there are, but they're not getting enough recognition and enough attention to find ourselves in the other and vice versa. That's been a project of this show for a long time from the very beginning, is to see the brokenness in self and the redemption in other, and to use that as a bridge towards our common humanity. Have we been successful about that? I don't know, man. I really don't know. I'm so grateful for the team that helps make this show. I'm so grateful for you, the listeners, that have been on this journey with us, and for the fabulous guests we've had. I have some vision for what to do for the program going forward. The wonderful Jenny Forrester, the author of Narrow River, Wide Sky, we've been trying to get her together with her to interview her. I'd love to get the author Lydia Yuknevich back on the show to talk about her meteoric rise and the work that she's doing with corporeal writing. Ijeoma Olu, the author, I've been trying to schedule a series of interviews with important, I think, at least, female and non-binary folks and non-white folks. We've had a slew of white men on the program in the past several months, including today's guest, who I'll get to in a minute. That hasn't been intentional. That hasn't been a subversive response to the Trump administration. It's just been the way it's broken as far as folks we've been able to connect with. I think you're going to enjoy today's guest. I'll get to him in a second. But regarding the show, producer Mike and I, Celeste Gurvich, we're gonna work on it as much as we can and as often as we can. We still have no funding whatsoever for this program. We never made the show in order to make money or to try to extract money. We don't have a subscription service, but it's increasingly difficult to make to the caliber that we'd like to make the show. And so again, our future is uncertain. We're trying to sort out what we're going to do. As it stands now, we're going to put a show up as often as we can once we have a guest and a program that we're proud of and that we want to share with you. So subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes. Go check us out at ontheblockradio.com and just follow the show. And when a new episode arrives, go ahead and check it out when you can. Before we get to today's guest, I used to do these things called show dedications. I'd pick a listener and dedicate the show to them, and I'd stopped doing that for a while, and I thought maybe I'd do that again here. I might have already dedicated a program to this individual, so if I have, please forgive me, and if I haven't dedicated one to you yet, and you're a person who's a loyal listener to the show, please understand that I'm getting around to it, and that we value each and every one of you around the country, around the state, here in Oregon, and around the world that listen to the program. But as the program moves into this phase of a kind of uncertain future, I think back to the very beginning of the show, and I just mentioned Lydia Yuknovich. I remember, I think she was our second interview, and for so long I'd wanted to do a program like this where I could, put together a show where I got to interview interesting people, talk to them about things that at least I thought were relevant and meaningful in the world, and then sort of wrap it into a sound package of music and interviews and other kind of tidbits that would bring you a sense, at least from my filter, of what this person means in the world. And so early on, I was just gripped with fear. I don't know, many of you, if you've listened to me over the years when I would be a guest on Chris Ryan's show, and I would be so nervous and just sweating and shaking, and I have all these notes and trying to prepare myself for this on-air personality and what it takes to interact with with people that I can't see, the listeners, and not able to read how you're responding to the material, responding to my voice or my ideas. And so I was horrified when we started this program, and I remember half hour, so I don't know, a little while into the interview with Lydia Yuknovich, I started to ask her a question, and my mind went blank. Completely blank. I had no idea what I was saying or where I was, or I knew where I was, but I just completely forgot the context of what I was asking, and I froze, and we were on air recording the show, and I had this moment of panic and started sweating, and I reached for my headphones the only thing that came to me was tear the headphones off, get up and run out of the room, right, and never come back into this space again with the guest or with producer Mike or with anything else in the context of this program. It's literally the only thing I could think of doing. And so I reached, this is while we're taping, I reached for my headphones to start ripping them off, and Lydia must have seen the look on my face, and she sort of just reached over and gently touched my arm as if to say, you got this, don't run away. You can do this. This matters, and your voice matters, and the show matters. And just that little gesture helped me to regain my confidence, regain my sense of place and awareness, and to soldier on. Maybe soldier is not the right word, but to move forward with the program. And I think that was a defining moment, not only for me as an individual, but for the program. I think had she not been there, had she not done that, I don't know if the show would have continued. And Lydia not only was a fabulous guest, still one of my favorite shows on the program, but has been a strong supporter of me and my teaching career, of the program, of my wonderful wife Celeste Gurvich, of her writing and her writing career, of many of the guests we've had on the program. So this episode goes out to the amazing author here in the Pacific Northwest, Lydia Yuknovich, and her brand new corporeal writing space that's open in downtown Portland. If you haven't read Lydia's work, if you haven't had the chance to study with her, please do. It'll be a life-changing experience, and one that I think you will cherish for the rest of your life. All right, on to today's guest. Tom Krattenmaker is a guy that I found out about in Dan Merchant's movie, Lord Save Us from Your Followers. His newest book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, Finding Answers in Jesus for Those Who Don't Believe, is something I think many of you would be interested in checking out. I love Tom and I love his work because he's part of this growing conversation that's taking place around the country and around the world, but he works at Yale University, at Yale Divinity School, and it's seeking to address this abiding need that we have for meaning and inspiration in what many are calling a post-religious America. I don't know how many of you follow this, but people are in many states are fleeing the pews and leaving the sort of standard Judeo-Christian religious affiliation and searching for other ways to connect in the world. And we've talked about this a lot on the show. A lot of people have fled to sort of Eastern traditions, Eastern religions, the hippie sort of Burning Man scene and ayahuasca tourism. There's all kinds of things that are occurring. The 2012 Mayan apocalypse craze. There's so many things that are happening that are pushing, that you see Westerners striving for a way to reconnect to that soul aspect that we've lost. We've demystified the world here in the West, and we've been suffering for it ever since we have. I've long contended that as a professor of religious studies and myth and literature, that our problem started way back at the beginning of civilization, when in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when Gilgamesh slays the guardian of the cedars of Lebanon, the ancient forest, simply because he wants to, and he ends up using those cedars to build monuments to himself back in the city of Uruk. And his companion Enkidu even says at the time in one of the manuscripts that this is probably a mistake, that there were guardians around these ancient relics, natural things, old-growth forests for a reason, and that to slay the spirits would give humans access to this material only to sort of build monuments to our own ego. And boy, howdy, are we sure there now. And as I said in the beginning of this, we become a people that really are obsessed with our own way of thinking, our own smaller communities, our own approaches, and our own understandings of things. And we've gotten really bad, I think, at embracing and understanding the other. And so when you have a guy like Tom, who is a professor of religious studies at Yale Divinity School and is an atheist, he's not a Christ follower, but he's there in the thick of it, engaged in a conversation about the significance of myth and the significance of story and the significance of finding meaning and inspiration in a post-religious America, in a post-fact America, in a post-truth America. What gives life meaning? What constitutes a life well led? These are things that follow us regardless of our belief system, regardless of our faith tradition. And in many ways, we need them, and we need these conversations now more than ever. And so Tom is a guy out on the forefront of doing what I think is essential work right now. If any of you follow me on Facebook, you know I use a hashtag, #ThereIsNoThem. And Tom is a guy that manifests that in so many ways. He doesn't follow Jesus. He's not a Christ follower, and yet he is engaged in the work right at ground zero at Yale Divinity School, trying to figure out what is it that makes a life, that constitutes meaning in a life. What is it that gives life meaning, and again, constitutes a life well led. And so we were so happy to have him on the show. I'll say this: we did this interview with Tom a few months back, and it was probably right around the time of the inauguration. And so we don't talk directly for too long about Trump and the Trump administration, but we do spend a few minutes on it, and it's fascinating to see, to think way back to January of this year, 2017, and look at a lot of the what-ifs that have turned into, in many ways, a lot of the things we feared as our country still continues to slide towards authoritarianism and giving itself fully over to a mechanism that is dehumanizing and robbing so many of us of our hope and of our ability to see a way forward together. So thank you, Tom, for being on the show. Thank you, listeners, for being with us. We're going to do the best that we can to keep bringing you quality shows about transformation, about transfiguration, about that path we are all walking into our own individual and collective becoming. All right, folks, we're glad you're here. We're glad you're back with us, and we hope you enjoy Tom Krattenmaker. This is your host, Andy Gurvich, and we will see you on the other side.
saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. Now I see. It was grace that taught my heart to fear, and it was grace that fear relieved. How precious did that grace appear? The hour I first believed. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Hey, Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, how's it going?
Not too bad, man. Thank you so much for doing the show.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I really appreciate it. So, all right, you ready to jump in?
Yeah, I have no idea what we're going to talk about, but let's do it.
Me either. I got a couple questions, but I tend to freeform it after that.
That's good. It's a good influence on me. I'm an over-preparer, but I didn't prepare at all for this.
I tend to be as well, but I've been busy this week, as it sounds like you've been, getting ready for the new school term. So I thought, I have some background in theology, and I was a pastor.
I noticed
for a while.
that. What do you have? You went to a seminary?
Yeah, I was Multnomah Bible College and then Western Conservative Baptist Seminary here in Portland.
What degree did you get? An MDiv or an MAR?
MA. Master's in Exegetical Theology.
Oh, okay.
And I was Greek, 4 years of ancient Greek total between the two schools and 3 of Hebrew. But then I left the faith. I was a pastor. I was an associate pastor at a church for a while, and walked away from the faith about 10 years ago.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, entirely.
Well, I've known about you for a few years. I didn't know you were friends with Dan.
Yeah, Dan and I became friends. Actually, what's funny is, this is a sort of unofficial. What we've done here, folks, is a soft intro. The show's begun, and we haven't actually begun the show, and that's fine because I wanted to talk about a little bit of this. But when I walked away from the church, what started with me was on social issues. Right, the church was gearing up to fight same-sex marriage, to fight. In Oregon, physician-assisted suicide, women's reproductive care.
Yep.
And I would pray about these things, and I would just come down on the other side of them. I would come away and go, I feel like we should support, physician-assisted suicide. And all of my colleagues would go, no, you're totally wrong.
No.
And I would come back and go, I think this way about immigration. Oh, no. And I thought, boy, I'm in the wrong church. And so that started a split with me that led to a theological split ultimately as well, where I just kind of shook the whole thing. And it was right when I walked away from the church. It was right when the new atheists emerged. Or, this is Marr and Richard Dawkins and those guys. And of course, none of it was new. The new atheism wasn't new at all. It was the same arguments people have been making, since there's been Christianity. But I fell into it. I saw Bill Maher's movie at the time and loved it. And then I rented Dan's movie thinking it was going to be another movie that was taking a hit at Christians because of the title. Because of, Lord Save Us from Your Followers. So you imagine my disappointment.
You're disappointed?
When I popped that thing in the DVD player and his movie came on. But I loved it so much and actually returned to it a couple of years later and use it in a writing, an argument analysis class. And I show both Bill Maher's movie and Dan Merchant's film, Lord Save Us from Your Followers, and have the students write argument analysis papers on it, because I find it really useful stuff, especially the stuff where he's interviewing you about some of the work you do. So I've come back to it in terms of I teach mythology and religion at the school. I write about it a lot. I'm really interested in Paleolithic religion. I see, we're going to get to you, right? We haven't really started the show yet, but that's all right. I see religions as these algorithms or scripts to help people access and engage symbolic consciousness to help foster, communal bonds. And so I dig what you're doing. I think that these chasms that are built between people of faith and the unfaithful, and how religious figures, especially Jesus, are used in political movements is deplorable and anemic. But we'll get to that with you in a minute. But that's my take on all this.
Hey, Andrew, do you have a copy of the Secular Jesus book?
I do not yet.
Okay, but it sounds like you're a little bit familiar with the content and the general premise.
Yes, absolutely. And I do know your other two books, and I just became aware of Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower when I started preparing to chat with you. So I will have it shortly and read it and be talking about it with guests coming up, because it seems like it's right up my alley.
Yeah, I hope so.
So you ready to jump in?
I'm ready to jump in.
All right, let's do it. All right, folks, welcome to the program. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Our guest this week is author Tom Krattenmaker. Tom is an award-winning author and USA Today contributing columnist, specializing in religion and public life. And he's the communications director at Yale Divinity School as well. His books and articles have been honored by the American Academy of Religion, Religion News Writers Association, Forward Reviews, and others. Krattenmaker has spoken at numerous conferences and colleges around the country and has appeared in media outlets including PBS, Fox News, National Public Radio, ESPN, and the New York Times. Excuse me, can't wait to ask you about that ESPN stuff. An award-winning USA Today columnist, Krattenmaker makes the case for how a Jesus freed from religion and politics meets the need for meaning and purpose in secular America. Tom Krattenmaker is a part of a growing conversation centered at Yale University that acknowledges and seeks to address the abiding need for meaning and inspiration in post-religious America. What, they ask, gives a life meaning? What constitutes a life well led? In his new book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, Krattenmaker shares his surprising conclusion about where input and inspiration might be best found in the figure of Jesus. And Jesus, not only as a good example and teacher, but Jesus as the primary guide for one's life. Drawing on sociological research, personal experience, and insights from 15 years of studying and writing on religion and American public life, Krattenmaker shows that in Jesus, non-religious people like himself can find a unique and compelling wisdom on how to honor the humanity in ourselves and others, how to build more peaceful lives, how generosity can help people and communities create more abundance, how to break free from self-defeating behaviors, and how to tip the scales towards justice. Sounds like a good program. In a time when in a time when more people than ever are identifying as atheist or agnostic, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower is groundbreaking and compelling work that rediscovers Jesus and our own best selves for the world today. Tom Krattenmaker, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, we are so glad to have you. Like I said, I first became aware of your work in Dan Merchant's movie, Lord Save Us from Your Followers. So how did you meet Dan? How did you end up talking with him and working on that project with him?
It was because of the movie.
Okay.
And I know that when you first heard about the movie, you thought it was just going to be an attack on right-wing Christians.
Yeah.
I thought the same thing. So back when he first discovered me, he had seen a USA Today piece that I'd written. And this was when I was pretty new at writing columns for USA Today. I think the headline was something like "Misplaying the God Card in Politics." Back then I was writing a lot about the abuses and excesses of the Christian right. And apparently while he was on a flight, Dan had seen somebody reading that article, and he tracked me down after that. And we did a couple interviews for the movie, and then we became friends. And he's one of the people I miss back in Portland. You know, I left 2 years ago to take this job at Yale, and Dan is one of the friends I had to leave behind.
You made him, I think you were one of the people, at least in the film, it looks like you were one of the folks that made him aware of like the night strike program here in Portland. Is that correct?
Actually, he made me aware of it.
Oh, okay,
He
fascinating.
turned me onto it. He gave me a tip, and I ended up writing a column about it, and then we talked about it on camera.
Well, that's fascinating. For our listeners that don't know that film, they should really check it out. There's some moving sections in it, like when Dan sets up a confession booth at Pride Parade here in Portland, but goes there to not hear confessions from LGBTQ folks, but to actually confess to them about his own
I agree.
apathy.
That was a
Yeah,
I
go
agree.
ahead.
That was a very moving scene, and to witness the words and the emotional responses of the people Dan was talking with. That's what was so moving. These people who had come to talk to Dan that way and hear his confession, these gay people who had been abused by so many Christians, they were so surprised and moved. It really made for a compelling scene.
And there's another sequence in the film where he strikes up a friendship with a member of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence in San Francisco, someone by the name of Sister Mary Timothy, who is again a gay man who had suffered a lot of abuse and contracted AIDS at a very young age, and was in San Francisco protesting a Christian group that was there to protest gay marriage on the steps of City Hall, and Dan ended up befriending this person and really getting invested in their life. And so, again, this isn't a conversation about Dan, it's about your work, but it's a good bridge into the stuff you do, because what I loved about what he's doing and then what I see you doing, and I think it's really powerful coming from you, because Dan is a believer, and so there's always this notion of, maybe someone is just trying to put the best foot forward of their own tradition as a kind of selling point. But tell us about the work you're doing, right, to address meaning in a post-religious America. And maybe first off, tell us, for our listeners that don't know what that means, what would you define as a post-religious America?
The context is so important.
Absolutely.
As we look at what's going on with the non-religious. It used to be not such an important point because there were so few non-religious people. And Christians were dominant. If you weren't Christian, you were probably Jewish. And it was really, really a fringe segment of the population, people who were atheists.
Right.
So what was going on in atheist America probably didn't matter all that much. But you know what? It matters a lot now.
Yeah.
Because the non-religious have grown to the point where we are about 25% of the population.
Wow.
And the figure is even higher among younger adult Americans, which means that the overall percentage is going to continue to go up and up and up. And this has not been the case at any time in recent history. So in my book, I describe it as sort of an experiment. What happens now? What's going to happen in this huge space in our culture where religion is receding? Because religion has played a big role in our culture. And so I see it as this ongoing, iterative effort, this experiment for the non-religious to find new ways of developing, finding, and providing community, inspiration, the impetus for being good and doing good, if we're making something out of our lives. And I think that's an important question. There are many sources people can turn to. For me, though, as I reflect on this and I look at what's messed up about our culture today and what could be really useful correctives, I keep returning over and over again to the example set by the figure of Jesus in the New Testament. It's kind of a shocking thing for some people to hear because they're not used to hearing Jesus spoken about in positive terms in these secular venues where I move.
Yeah.
But I also
it's a really powerful thing. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what's kind of good about it, too. And after all, this is a day and age of fluid and hybrid religious identities, people combining different things. So from that standpoint, I'm in sync with what's going on. And I have to say, too, that for many years, I've heard people say that, I'm not really a Christian, but I really dig what Jesus was about. And if only they were more like Jesus, I'd be on board. And since the book has come out, I've had lots of people say to me that, hey, that's really what I am. I'm with you on that, or I totally get where you're coming from. So I don't think I'm saying anything that's brand new. Maybe some of my language is new, but I think that this idea has been out there percolating a little bit below the surface, sort of unofficially, and I'm just trying to make it more available and more accessible to people now.
Well, I think it's fascinating, and I want to ask you a couple more questions about this new book, and then maybe some of your earlier work as well. But in your intro, I mentioned that you're working with a group of people at Yale, looking at this idea of this abiding need for meaning and inspiration. What gives a life meaning? What constitutes a life well led? And what's really interesting is that, and I can speak from personal experience in my own life, and then as a pastor, and then now as a teacher. of these things, and also just writing and literature and stuff, that when somebody engages a faith tradition, or whether they don't engage it, or whether they do for a while then walk away from it, our need as people to find these systems, or find these connections that give our life a coherence and give it meaning and give us a kind of a narrative with momentum towards something approaching connectivity with the cosmos. That need doesn't go away, whether we're religious people or not. And so I think it's fascinating. Would you agree with that? I think it's interesting that even if more people are atheists or agnostic, the awe and sense of gratitude that we feel when we look up at the night sky doesn't go away regardless of how we define ourselves. And so the fact that you're exploring for how we can connect to that and actually build a life around it, even if we're not a part of these faith traditions, is huge.
I'm involved in something called the Yale Humanist Community, which is more or less the humanist chaplaincy at Yale and in the surrounding community. We also serve the community of Greater New Haven. And I'm on the board. I attend pretty much all the stuff that we put on. And that's what's going on. And I see it as being part of a really important shift that is happening in secular America. When you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned the new atheists.
Yeah.
You know, Dawkins, Hitchens, Sam Harris, and so forth. It's been over 10 years since that phenomenon happened.
Wow, that's right.
And as I've been saying in my talks and in some articles I've been writing, in fact, I have a big essay about this coming out in The Humanist in a few weeks. But something very different now is happening in this secular space.
Yeah.
I think there's a pivot away from what the new atheists were about, i.e. what's wrong with religion, criticizing religion, belittling religion, away from that and toward, well, so as secular people, what are we about?
Right.
We have this unofficial motto at the Yale Humanist Community, Andrew, and it says, there's more to being non-religious than what you don't believe.
Yeah.
Which I think is a pretty good saying. And so that begs a question, what do we believe? What are we about? How are we going to find meaning? How are we going to contribute to our communities? I like the phrase you use. How are we going to build momentum towards something approaching transcendence, if you will? And so this is a really important phenomenon happening. And I feel actually kind of excited to be part of an organization that is on the front edge of this new thing that's happening in secular culture.
You know, where
I think it's overdue and it's high time.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I've described to people before that for me, my atheist experience coming out of the pastorate was exactly what you were talking about. And this doesn't describe the experience of many atheists, but just for me, I describe it as shaking my fist at an empty sky. And you can only do that for so long, right? You can only be mad at nothing for so long before you have to embrace the void or fill it with something, right? Besides, alcohol and Netflix or something, right? But speaking of Netflix, and
I would say that the shaking the fist does play a purpose. It has a role.
Go ahead.
And even though I was critical of the new atheists at the time, I'm willing to say in retrospect that maybe they played a role, an important and necessary role. They served a purpose. The way I describe that is they're sort of like the shock troops who go into hostile territory, and with their aggressive ways, they clear out a space. They establish something. And what they've done, as I see it, is that they've cleared out a space for non-religious people of milder temperament to come in and do their thing in a different way. Yes. That's one way of seeing what's been happening in the roughly 10 years or more since this series of anti-religion manifestos came out.
And your book really presages of something I'm seeing in entertainment now. If you look at what's going on, I mentioned Netflix a second ago. These shows, whether it's Stranger Things or the OA or Black Mirror, there's a whole bunch of them that are bringing in spiritual themes into the programming, but not traditional spiritual themes, or at least not in the traditional sense. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of that in sort of current programming.
Well, that would be indicative of what I would say is the fact that, the quest continues. The search is still on. Sadly, I would say religion as we know it is proving to be less able to address this, less robust as a means of addressing this. And I do say this with some regret. I do work at a Christian divinity school here at Yale, and I think that there's a lot that's good about this place and a lot that's good about Christianity. So when I talk about the decline of conventional religion in America. It's not something that I necessarily celebrate,
Right.
but it is what it is. And it is a fact that in this very different cultural moment that we're having, conventional religion seems to be less able to serve as this vehicle through which people can find these things. A lot of people still can find it through churches, but more and more people can't. But what hasn't changed, I would say, is the ongoing search for meaning, and all sorts of experiments are happening. How can people find it without churches?
Yeah.
Or how can churches change to provide it? And so that does seem to be, I hate to say anything grandiose or make any overly sweeping claims, but it seems to be a universal, timeless part of the human experience. And it certainly isn't going away now, even though we have more and more non-religious people in the Western world.
Can you give us an example? So you talk about in this book how secularists can look to Jesus for insights into a lot of things, into how to live their lives, how to break addictions, how to become stronger in their relationships. And so how did you arrive at those kinds of things in this text?
It was a combination of looking at what is broken in our culture today, which is something I've been doing now for over 10 years as a writer on religion in public life in America, spending a lot of time looking at what's messed up about our politics, thinking about the things about our life today that make me either disillusioned or frustrated or angry or depressed. And then juxtaposing all these things, all this diagnosing I've been doing with the example of Jesus and the stories of Jesus in the New Testament. And I started to see that it was amazing the degree to which they addressed all the stuff we go through now.
Give us an example.
And how they were such a powerful corrective, and how, you asked for an example,
Sure.
and I'll get to one, but
sure. Yeah,
there's a
keep
consistent
going.
theme that I found, and that is that a lot of the things that are happening today, at the root of the problem is that people are being dehumanized, and we're going through experiences, many of us, that are dehumanizing. And I saw that what Jesus is doing over and over again is sort of rehumanizing people who have been dehumanized and rehumanizing situations that are dehumanizing. And I even refer to him in the book at one point as the great humanizer.
Wow.
Because over and over again, he was seeing the humanity in people in whom humanity was most difficult to see. Like even the biggest assholes.
Yeah.
And people we hated the most. He could see the humanity in them.
Right.
I mean, to kind of a ridiculous degree. But something about that got in my head, and it's inspiring and challenging at the same time. And I was really sort of caught up in the momentous importance of that and the relevance of that to so much that's going on today. So the book is basically a series of examples. In between the intro and the reflections at the end, I have these chapters that look at problems that we have today, both as individuals and as a society, whether it's our racism or the sexual exploitation that we engage in, or our addiction to over-incarceration, or whether it's our personal and social anxiety. And I look at all these things that are happening, and then I map onto that what you might call the way of Jesus or the wisdom of Jesus, and sort of show how the Jesus way can be transformative when we look at the things that are problematic about our lives today. And so to drill down more deeply in one of them, which one would you really want to talk about, Andrew? Would it be racism or anxiety or sexism or violence? Because there are chapters on all of them.
Sure. How about go ahead?
Yeah, pick one.
How about anxiety?
Okay, that's a good one, because that's when I address both on a personal level and when I look at social anxiety.
Yeah.
And it's really good too, because if you look at the election that just happened and this whole Trump phenomenon, I would posit that anxiety was a major driver.
That's why I picked it, by the way.
An underlying factor. What's that?
That's why I picked that example, because I think it's something a lot of people are experiencing both before and the lead up to and after the election on both sides of the equation. So that's why I picked
and I've had sort of a lifelong off and on struggle with my own anxiety. Even when I was a kid, I would get nervous about things and always feeling like the other foot's going to drop. Or how does that cliche go? The other shoe is going to drop.
You look like a pretty calm dude from your pictures, and so you hide.
Well, man, I'm great at deceiving.
Right.
And
so go ahead. Yeah, anxiety.
We are anxious and driven by anxiety's cousin, which is fear. we are never going to be at our best. We're going to do dumb things and mean things, hurtful things. We're going to hurt ourselves and others. We're going to fall into a pattern of scarcity where we think there's not enough, and that's going to drive our selfishness. It's going to curb any capacity we might have for generosity. So it's very, very problematic. I think there's a very close relationship between these things: fear and anxiety, and stinginess.
Right.
And I get into all of that particular chapter. And so then you hold that in your mind, and you think about the stuff that Jesus said and did in the Bible. Think about what he said in the Sermon on the Mount about the lilies in the field and the birds in the air, and the wisdom and the beauty in just experiencing what's good about the moment and not obsessing about what's going to happen the next day or the next week. Now, mind you, if people go overboard with that, they're going to do some really dumb and bad things.
Right.
I try to differentiate in the chapter. I try to make the differentiation between worry on one hand and maybe productive thinking on the other hand.
Right.
I mean, obviously you do need to plan for things, but worry is so unproductive.
Smart.
It's so debilitating. It's so pointless. And I really think that Jesus was trying to get at that.
Yeah.
There are examples over and over again of Jesus sort of stealing away from the tumult to meditate, pray in his case, because let's face it, he was a very religious person.
Yeah.
There are stories over and over again where the disciples are freaking out about a situation just like me. And Jesus is totally calm, and he almost chides them for being so anxious and hyped up. He's sort of like, chill, dudes, it's going to be okay.
Right.
And I actually tried to do my own secular exegesis of the parable of the loaves and fishes to get at this. You can probably picture the story in your mind, and hopefully the listeners can. You know, they have the situation going on that is exactly the kind of thing that stresses me out. There's this big crowd that's gathered. Jesus seems to be intimating that somehow they're going to have to like come up with a way to feed them all. Yet no planning had taken place for this. A couple of the disciples are like, how in the hell are we going to feed all these people?
Right.
And I know I hate it when I'm in situations where I'm seemingly forced to come up with some like solution to a problem I didn't create. There seem to be no solutions. Like, why is it on me to come up with a solution to this?
Right.
That seems to be what disciples are doing. So I could really relate.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too.
What disciples were saying. Jesus is basically like, calm down. We'll come up with something. I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Right, of course. Yeah. This is like
And
that
then
Bible they did
something
in the 70s. Yeah.
And then something happens. So when they did their official inventory about the food that they had almost none. You know, there was this kid who had a little bit of bread and some fish. And then for religious people, as you know, the essence of the story is that there's a miracle. And Jesus suddenly produces food enough to feed all these 5,000 people, and still there are leftovers.
Right.
And that's fine. You know, I'm not one who discounts. I don't believe in miracles myself, but I know intelligent, wise people who do, and I don't disparage them for that.
The point of the conversation is not to say there's no miracles, right?
But there's always a secular way at looking at these things too, and I spend a lot of time looking at it. And so my take on it is that something happens to spark generosity. And okay, so officially there was almost no food. There was only this kid with the fish and the bread. But I would say that a lot of other people had food, and they were kind of holding out. They had it stashed somewhere, maybe on their in their cloak or somewhere on the perimeter. When they were asked, if they were asked, they said, "Oh, I don't have anything." And then suddenly something happened, and the dynamic shifted from scarcity, i.e. hoarding, i.e. stinginess, to abundance. And when there's a feeling of abundance, then suddenly we are our best selves, and we share. And we can think with wisdom instead of with some kind of fear-based nonsense. And so my take on it is that Jesus inspired them to be generous and to operate out of abundance. And suddenly, lo and behold, there's enough for everybody, and even a whole bunch of leftovers. And I think that really maps onto what's happened in our lives when we tap into abundance and generosity and a feeling of well-being and gratitude and appreciation for have, rather than like always being stingy and musing about how little we have. And these are things that I struggle with.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's really striking how applicable the Jesus example is here, and how transformative it can be if we can somehow implement it in our lives individually and collectively.
That's really powerful, and it reminds me of two parables I heard. One very short that said the only problem with equality is we tend to only desire it with those above us, right? And
Wow.
And that feeds that notion of greed or stinginess, or always focusing on scarcity, like what I don't have versus what I do,
Exactly.
and what I have to share. And there's another story that I'm sure you've heard. It's a parable of someone dying and being, and this is, it's one of those, you die and St. Peter takes you to the yada yada kind of things. And so the theology on this is kind of suspect, but roll with it for a second. He takes a guy and he opens a door and he says, "This is hell." And it's a bunch of people sitting around a table, and there's all kinds of delicious food on the table. But they're all kind of at the table, and they all have forks that are like 4 feet long, that are kind of like however, like fused to their hands, right? And so they when they pick the food up, they're not able to turn it and get it in their own mouths, and so the people are starving.
Bizarre.
Yeah, they're all starving, even though they're sitting at a table filled with all this delicious food. And so then he says, "Do you want to see heaven?" And the guy says, "Sure." And he takes him to another room, and he opens it, and it's the same room, same table, same food, same forks, but the people are just feeding each other across the table, and everyone's eating and having a wonderful time. And it's such an illustration of exactly what you're talking about. I think it's really beautiful.
It really is, and it's such a theme of I'm thinking about this, and of my book too. Over and over again, I end up arriving at generosity and seeing the humanity in others and extending ourselves to others. This is not some big new insight. I mean, people have known this forever, but it's so hard to get there and stay there.
I really
think it continues to be part of the timeless wisdom, and Jesus was a great exemplar of this. And I think we really need that now. I think I really need that.
Some of the work I do is in Neolithic and Paleolithic religion, and I really do think that when we lived in smaller, when people lived in units of 100, 125 people, and we were hunter-gatherers, two things were different. One is you pretty much knew everybody that you lived with, right? You had generational relationships with the people you were around, and everyone knew each other's names and kind of grew up together. And secondly, there wasn't a lot of private property because people lived in these small bands of hunter-gatherers, and so everything was sort of shared equally for the most part. Not in every situation, but for the most part. And so as that changed with the beginning of civilization, two things changed, right? We start to have the with hunter-gatherer societies moving into agricultural societies, we have the beginning of cultures who have excess for the first time, and that brings wealth, and with wealth that brings class. And then with a population explosion, suddenly you're living in a city that has 50,000, 100,000, 7 million people, and now everyone doesn't know one another. And also a competition for resources and ownership of resources becomes a really kind of brutal thing that we all, the world wars have been fought over these very kinds of things. And so religions then focus their attention on how do we get people to develop these empathy scripts? How do we remind people of their inherent connectivity to one another? And I really think the way you're approaching these texts really emphasizes that.
Well, Jesus was like a whole breakthrough, it seems to me. And I've read the observations of other philosophers and experts on morality who have said this about him too, both religious and non-religious writers. His willingness to go way beyond just being kind and generous with our immediate communities or our tribes, and taking it to a much more universal, to a totally universal direction, and seeing the humanity in everybody, even people who are part of the wrong group or the wrong religion, whatever wrong affiliation they had. There's a chapter that I used to address this at the very beginning of the book, which I call Bad Company. Jesus hanging out with and identifying with the wrong people.
Right.
Which was probably pretty shocking to a lot of people then, and probably got a lot of people angry at him. If he was transgressing, this was one of the major ways that he did it. But it was also really profound and so beneficial. And that, too, is something we still need 2,000 years later. Look at the talk we have now in America about whether Muslims should be stopped from coming into the United States.
Right.
And we have divided up into these sort of tribes that pretty much hate each other. So that's part of the sort of endless struggle that we have as human beings.
A question I have for you, and I'll maybe ask you one more question, and then we'll go to break and come back. And I want to ask you about some of the other work you've done as well. But maybe two more questions before we go to break. It seems like you're mostly pulling from the Gospels when you're talking about the life and work and words of Jesus, right? So do you not use like the epistles and the Revelation and sort of the other work in the New Testament? Do you not pull from that stuff? Is it mostly the Gospels that you're working from?
A couple times from Paul, but it's mostly from the Gospels, and it's a lot of it is from the Sermon on the Mount. To be honest,
Yeah.
The Jesus examples and teachings I pull out, I'm not doing anything very surprising there.
Yeah.
It's pretty much the stuff that Jesus is best known for.
Right.
So no breakthroughs there. This is, common material, but I do have my my own interpretation of how it applies to what we go through now, and obviously my own secular take on it. So hopefully that's where there's sort of a new contribution and some new thinking, and probably some new language for talking about Jesus in a way that makes him available and understandable and accessible to non-religious people today.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. If we want to have a conversation, which is this program isn't about denominations or about Christian theology or the creeds or the canon or Pauline theology, there's a lot to the conversation of what does or does not make someone a Christ follower in terms of how that's hashed out over time. But when you look to the Gospels, especially in the example there of the narrative character, his interactions with people are pretty simple and pretty straightforward and tend to not come with a lot of that complexity and tend to really be about these kinds of direct and, as you said before, humanizing kinds of or rehumanizing things. I wonder, lastly, before we go to break, in your work, do you engage other religious figures and traditions besides Jesus and Christianity? And if not, why just these?
A little bit. I'm not an exclusivist, and I believe that we can find wisdom and inspiration from many figures in the pantheon.
Sure.
And I cite a few of them. In the chapter about violence, I talk at some length about Martin Luther King Jr., who is a very successful user of nonviolence during the civil rights movement. So that was a great example. And I touch on Gandhi and some other figures. And in the conversations that I've been having since the book, I've had people tell me that, I get what you're saying, Tom. Jesus isn't number one for me. I get more out of the Buddha. And I'm thinking, great. If people are finding great sources of inspiration and insight and ethical formation, I say go for it.
Right.
For me, Jesus is definitely the most exciting figure to engage with. And I would say that of all the figures out there, Jesus is the best or one of the best. But I'm never going to say that it's only Jesus or you're lost. Because as I say, I'm not an exclusivist. And I'm happy if anybody is finding good stuff from whatever figure.
Yeah, I've never encountered your work as an exclusivist. I guess if anything, I would see you as a specialist in this area, right? That you just tended to focus on this because you find a lot of stuff to do work on there. You know what I mean? You haven't run out of things to say and talk about and research in this area, so you haven't felt the need to move on to the other ones yet. And
I acknowledge that my focusing on Jesus here in my own ethical life and in my writing probably has something to do with the fact that I grew up in the United States of America.
Yeah, exactly.
In a certain era when, I'm in my mid-50s now, so when I was growing up, it was much more of a Christian country.
Right.
And so you were pretty much necessarily and inevitably going to be exposed to a lot of Jesus stuff. So there was a lot of familiarity.
And I think
and
that's
even
what
though
makes
the church stuff never really stuck with me, the Jesus stuff really stayed with me, at least in the back of my mind for a long time, and then started moving from the back toward the front of my mind.
Fascinating. And I was just going to say that too. The second thing is, in this culture, when dealing with the Jesus story and the character of Jesus, you're really dealing with an accessible figure and symbol, even for folks who aren't religious, because they've been so steeped in it through American culture. So there's the relevance there as well. All right, well, let's go to break, and then I want to ask you a couple more questions about Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, and then about your previous book, because that's the book that I'm more familiar with, The Evangelicals You Don't Know.
All right, we'll do it.
Great, folks. You're listening to On the Block Radio. Our guest is Tom Krattenmaker, and we will be back right after these words.
Slava Vakarchuk is Ukraine's biggest rock star. He's the frontman of the popular band Okeen Elzy. Raised in the Orthodox tradition, the self-described Christian jumped onto the stage as a teenager. And all these years later, Vakarchuk has become an institution, not only because of his music, but his social and cultural activism. These days, his surroundings are a bit quieter on the campus of Yale University, where he's a World Fellow taking classes at the Divinity School. Yes, a rock star in seminary.
I'm just an inquisitive person, you know. I like studying, I like learning new things, and I never had anything from some theologians or taking, classes on theology or things like that. So I was very curious, and I'm very happy to be here.
And it seems Vakarchuk isn't the only one happy to be here. He's part of a growing trend at divinity schools across the country, where students are enrolling in similar programs simply to study theology, with no intention of ever becoming ordained as clergy.
When you go to Yale University or to the other university to study history, it's not because you want to become a historian or a teacher of history at school. Sometimes you want to know history because knowing history enriches you, broadens up your mind, horizons, and makes you a wiser person. The same thing with theology.
And this desire to broaden the mind is also attracting other students from faraway places with surprising belief systems.
One of the students, for instance, told us that she had the need to think about those things. She herself is an atheist from India.
So you're an atheist from India?
Who came as a Yale student and who took our class. We welcome atheists, we welcome theists, we welcome religious people who aren't theists. Everybody's welcome. Indeed, we try to have a very diverse group of folks. But what she didn't know, didn't see, or didn't experience before is that she would have a permission to think in academic terms about the great question of life. For her, that was a revelation.
Professor Miroslav Volf, a prominent theologian and head of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, is teaching several courses at Yale that give students permission to think in an academic environment about the great questions of life. Christ and the Good Life and A Life Worth Living are drawing students with diverse interests that all have similar intentions.
What motivated these courses is a sense that in culture today, we tend to spend a lot of time thinking about how to succeed in one or the other endeavor that we undertake. But we tend to spend very little time thinking about how do I succeed as a human being.
Teaching how to succeed as a human being also includes exploring historical, philosophical, and sociological lessons. The course has deepened student Taylor Bolton's understanding of life.
I also believe that nothing is completely academic. Nothing is completely social. And there's a spiritual component, I think, to everything.
And the spiritual component seems to be an element students are seeking to explore in a deeper way. The study of religion offers a different but welcomed foundation.
It's not that I need to be converted or not that I need to get a job after that. It's something that, I want to go deeper. This is it.
Whether it's a rock star or a business major, the elements of spirituality are being studied as the basis for living a good life. At Harvard University, Gregory Epstein, who is the humanist chaplain and describes himself as an agnostic and atheist, figured out a long time ago that there was more to religion than religion. He's been recruiting others, including non-believers, to the Divinity School.
A lot of what religion is about on the day-to-day level for people is exploring what's most meaningful to people, exploring community, and figuring out how to come together with a community to make the world a better place. And that was the topic that I wanted to spend the rest of my life learning about.
And coming together is exactly what Harvard Divinity School student Christopher Raish is hoping to achieve. He founded a group called White People Against Racism to fight social injustice. Although he describes himself as, quote, not very theistic, He uses the fundamentals of religion to try to change some of the attitudes that perpetuate racism.
The ways that religions have developed practices and liturgies and methods for cultivating the heart, for opening us up to the curious quality of being here as a human and how to live that beautifully, how to live that deeply. That is just, to me, the real treasure. I'm just seeing and appreciating how that is lived so deeply by so many different people of different faiths.
Raish's group meets at the Humanist Hub, an off-campus place Epstein created to bring people together to connect with others who are interested in making the world a better place. They meet on Sundays, they read poems, sing songs, and listen to guest speakers. In fact, it even feels a little like, well, church, but it isn't.
I'm finding more and more that non-religious people are looking around and saying, wait a second, I'm not religious, but I do miss the idea of community that I would get if I were religious, and I wish I could find some kind of non-religious alternative to that kind of community.
As Raish sees it, the Humanist Hub is one compelling answer.
It's all aiming toward how to be a more intimate participant in civic life and in relationship with the world, but doing it through economics, science, art, whatever it might be.
According to the Pew Research Center, the number of people who consider themselves to be religiously unaffiliated, including atheists and agnostics, is on the rise, about a fifth of the U.S. population. Some are turned off by too much politics and too many rules in organized religion. Others say faith and facts don't add up. But those numbers don't mean non-believers can't find value in religion, its traditions, and even the teachings of Jesus.
Use every opportunity to talk about it.
This is a topic author Tom Krattenmaker explores in his new book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower.
I've been sensing and hearing from other people who are not part of organized religion anymore, but who really admire Jesus. They're not quite sure if Jesus is available to them. They're not quite sure if it's legit for them to engage with Jesus as a non-religious person. So I wanted to make Jesus available to people like that, including me. I wanted to articulate what it is about Jesus that appeals to me and makes me inspired by Jesus.
And what exactly does Jesus offer non-believers besides salvation?
There's ethical instruction, there's inspiration, there are these very rich stories that help us reorient the way we see the world and the way we live our lives. It's amazing that these stories from 2,000 years ago are so salient and helpful today.
Those sentiments are echoed by Wolf back in the classroom at Yale. And while all views are welcomed and respected, he does not waver on his own beliefs.
From the get-go in the class, it's clear that I am a Christian. I believe that Christian faith is true. I would be happy if a person would embrace this, but my goal is not to evangelize them, to turn them into Christians. My goal is, as a teacher, is to referee their own search where they take seriously the question of truth.
And students like Vakarchuk, curious about theology, and other believers seeking to enrich their lives as they launch into secular careers, say Divinity School will have a lasting influence. For Religion and Ethics News Weekly, I'm Dan Lothian in Boston.
Hello, here we go. Hello, this is Dr. Stanley Krippner, and I am on the Block Radio. Oh, pardon me, let's do that over. Hello, this is Dr. Stanley Krippner, and you are listening to On the Block Radio. Radio.
Welcome back to the program, folks. This is your host, Andy Gurbich. We're speaking with Tom Krattenmaker, and when we left, we were talking about your newest book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, and I guess I wonder, you mentioned working at a Christian institution, and, you know, having taken the book around now for a little bit, I wonder, how is the book being received, and is there a difference in how, your fellow secular sort of sojourners receive the book, and maybe how religious people or Christians have received the book.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. Generally, people are pretty positive about it. And I've had a lot of encouragement and compliments, appreciation. As I mentioned earlier, people have said to me, yeah, I totally relate to what you're saying. I've thought of myself that way, or I think of myself that way. Then there are Christians who are just happy that people are seeing something awesome in Jesus like they do. And so they take heart in that and find that interesting, and they find it helpful that I have some of this new language for talking about Jesus in ways that are helpful and can make him understandable and accessible to wider groups of people. Then when you look at the more militant and adamant precincts in atheism and secularism, there's been some pushback there. Some people just have a hard time extricating Jesus from religion, and they've heard Jesus invoked so many times in contexts that they find off-putting, that Jesus is sort of radioactive to them.
No matter what.
So they think what I'm doing is kind of wrong or crazy, and they think it'll end up promoting Christianity.
You're keeping the door cracked open for all of this hateful stuff,
Yeah, so they're sort of doing the Heisman on me in the book. And maybe even suspecting that I'm not truly secular.
Oh, yeah, that you're some kind of Christian mole, right?
Yeah.
You look pretty clean cut, man.
Part,
so yeah.
When they see what I'm doing, they do accept it. For example, there's one adamant and militant atheist who I found out was going to review the book, and I'm like, oh God, he's going to rip it apart,
shred it, yeah.
But then when he actually read the book, he wrote a positive review, and he said that I'm not into Jesus like Tom is, but I see what he's saying here. And these values that he's surfacing and promoting through the figure of Jesus are good values that all humanists and people of good faith would want to promote and engage with. So yeah, it's a good contribution. So I was pleased by that. But the people who have been most displeased would be sort of the fundamentalist Christians.
Yeah.
And they've thought that that the book was either dangerous. I was listening to a conservative Christian radio show where they were talking about it, and I just started laughing. Their terms were so over the top. They used words like cancer and poison.
Wow.
To describe the book. And then there are others who are good-hearted people who are trying to be open-minded, but they see what I'm doing as such a act of radical decontextualization.
Yeah.
They just can't stick with it. They think Jesus is so profoundly religious.
Right.
And such a part of the religious story that you cannot look at him in a secular way.
That you're sort of watering down or taming Jesus,
or just doing something that is incomprehensible,
right,
and makes no sense. And I've come to see in what they're saying, I understand it. For me, it's just natural. It's not a big deal to separate Jesus from religion and look at him in a secular way and not really worry about the religious stuff. But I've come to see that for some people, it is a little bit too much to ask of them.
Right.
And so be it. I'm trying to practice Jesus-style non-defensiveness when it comes to critics of the book. So I understand where they're coming from. They can have their say. Everybody can have their say. It's fine.
I have some friends who are pastors and Jesus followers, and I know right away that a couple of them would absolutely love this book and what you're doing, and a couple of them would fall on that other side and call you an absolute agent of Satan, and they would think that what you were doing, and we have them here now. No, I'm kidding. I thought, I think they would think what you were doing is exactly what you said, that you were somehow taming Jesus. They don't like liberal Jesus. My conservative Christian friends always say, we hate your liberal mamby-pamby Jesus. Jesus is a divider. Jesus is going to come to throw people into hell. Jesus, they have a very different, and again, this conversation isn't, let's sit here and bash those people who aren't even here to defend themselves. But I'm interested in this because I hadn't even thought about those on the sort of far left that might have a difficult time with the book. But having to sort of deal with this figure who, unless you know something I don't, you're there at Yale, there's not even, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's not even full consensus that we're dealing with an historical figure here. So the primary texts that we're interacting with this person through are the gospel narratives.
Well, some people have brought that up with me too, and that's been one source of criticism of what I'm doing.
Interesting.
And,
Well, how do you respond to that? I don't know if it's a criticism from my standpoint.
It doesn't matter if
but
it's,
yeah.
it doesn't,
Yeah.
this will sound just like crazy pragmatic to you, but it doesn't matter whether the stuff is factually true or not.
I couldn't agree more, actually. Yeah.
Because the wisdom is still wise,
Right.
and the inspiration is still inspiring, and the insights are still insightful, and we can still benefit from these things tremendously. Now, let me back up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be totally fascinated by the quest for the historical Jesus.
Sure.
I even went to a Jesus seminar event one time.
Oh, I was going to ask you about that,
90s
Marcus
and
Borg and that whole thing.
And I knew Marcus Borg when I lived in Portland.
Yeah,
And
you went
I'm
down
sorry
there.
that he's now the late Marcus Borg because I really liked him and read a lot of his books. And so I'm into the quest for the historical Jesus, but not for my new book. In Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, I'm engaging with what you might call the face value Jesus.
Yeah.
The Jesus who says and does stuff on the pages of the New Testament, and it doesn't matter whether they're journalistically accurate. What matters is what we can learn from them.
When I was in seminary, we had a rabbi come in. Our faculty member brought a rabbi in. I was in Christian, a fundamentalist evangelical Christian seminary, and he brought a rabbi friend of his in to give his take on Pauline theology to us. And the guy stood up and laid out his understanding of Pauline theology, Christian theology, in a way that blew our socks off. None of us in the class, especially at that time when we were all undergrads, so this is the undergrad program, not in seminary, had a presentation of Pauline theology presented to us in anything remotely resembling that level of understanding and complexity. And this was from a rabbi, and he wasn't a Jew for Jesus. And the first question was, did he believe in Jesus? And he said no, right? And then the second question was, after he had laid out his presentation, was, how do you understand this stuff so well? You know what I mean? Like, we were shocked that a non-believer, he was a rabbi, but he wasn't a Christian. And so we were all blown away that somebody from outside of our community would have such a monumentally clear understanding of these texts. And what he talked about how the fact that he understood Paul as a rabbi and his understanding of Messiah, that he just didn't think Jesus was Messiah. But I would add to that sometimes having a little space, sometimes not having to defend these texts and not having the burden of needing to believe in things like inspiration and inerrancy and all of the kinds of things that go along with that really frees you to have a simpler relationship with the text that I think can reveal some fundamental truths that I think even believers would benefit from. I think even Christ followers who are not secular could learn some things from this book about their own understanding of the person they follow in a spiritual context.
Yeah, that's my hope. I think you used the word burden.
Yeah.
And I've been completely unburdened by these things that may vex a Christian theologian.
Yeah.
And I write about this at the end of the book when I reflect on who Jesus can be to us as secular people today. And I talk about this radical freedom that we have. I mean, we're not trying, as secular people who might be into Jesus, we're not looking for the approval of any church. And we can't really be heretics because we're not within church confines. We have this radical freedom to do and believe what we will when it comes to this figure of Jesus. We're not looking for anybody's approval.
Right.
And nobody can really stop us when you look at it pragmatically.
Right.
And why would they want to, or how could they? I mean, it would be absurd. Imagine it. Somebody's like, oh, Tom, you're becoming a more generous person who is able to better see the humanity in everybody and contribute more to your community and help others and yourself find more selfless ways of living and finding more meaning in life. But you know what? You don't believe in Jesus the right way, so you have to stop. I mean, that's absurd.
Right.
And so what I've been saying in some of these interviews I've been doing and some of these talks when people ask me about these things, I say that there is this radical freedom. And I don't have to worry about things like heresy and theology and all that. There are definitely other problems with what I'm doing, but that's not the problem.
But that's not one of them. And ironically, that's another Jesus attitude. I'm sorry, you were going to say the problem is what?
Well, yeah, the problem is actually an age-old one, and that is that it's really hard to follow Jesus.
It's hard to do, isn't it? Especially in evening traffic.
Right, and especially if you're not part of some kind of a community. I mean,
good point.
For all their flaws, churches are the best places probably for following Jesus. For some of us, that's not going to work because there's a whole lot of God belief that goes with it.
Right.
That goes with it, and we're not able to muster that.
The ecclesia, right? People
And
can,
so the
can
problem
mirror for
is
each
that
other. Yeah.
the problem isn't that we're heretics. It's that our Jesus following, if we say we're going to be secular Jesus followers, this following could be as thin and light as a piece of paper. It could be so trivial. It could easily fade away, and we could just ditch it whenever the going gets tough. And that's why I feel fortunate that I'm part of this ethical community where we're having these conversations and thinking hard about our lives, being intentional about our ethics. Because I don't think that I'd get very far without those things or without other sources and practices and structures and so forth.
See, this is fascinating to me. And are you familiar with the work of Stephen Prothero?
Yeah, I've read a couple of his books.
Yeah, he does. I think he was at Boston University, and he wrote a book called Religious Literacy. The one that I read. I know he's written some other ones. He's got more recent ones too. But I'm fascinated in this idea in how many Americans have such a low literacy of religious faith. And I think the reason that is important is for what you're talking about now, and especially you mentioned the Trump age earlier, especially, as we have this feel, at least on things like social media, that people are sort of, the chasm between people is growing and our terminology is becoming more fierce and intolerant with one another. And as we understand one another less, the ability to caricaturize and respond to versions of one another that are built on this fear, this fear and anger that we were talking about in the beginning of our conversation grows. And I'm just wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, because what I think, I would love to, we were talking about Bill Maher before, when you watch his movie Religulous, which is also, 10 years or more old now, it's him driving around to truck stops and other places trying to find people who claim to have religious faith and then completely trying to overwhelm them in a quick kind of, flashy, professional comedian kind of way. And that's entertaining, but it's not very useful. What I would rather see is folks like you and Prothero and others, on his show to have a real conversation about religion in America and secularism in America and how people can use these books like yours to really build bridges of understanding to one another. I think now more than ever, this is important. I mean, do you see where I'm going with that?
I do. And when we were talking about examples from my work about ways in which the Jesus example, the Jesus wisdom could be transformative. What I didn't mention, I don't think, is that one of my chapters in the book is about our broken politics.
Go ahead. No, you hadn't mentioned that.
So in this chapter, I take one of the most famous Jesus teachings, namely love your enemy, and try to apply that to what's going on in our politics.
Yeah, not so well.
And I took this on more directly toward the end of the summer when I wrote a column for USA Today where I tried to apply this idea in the hardest way imaginable. I'm not sure I completely pulled it off in the piece, but I talked about what would it look like for us liberals and Hillary Clinton supporters to, quote, love Trump. That's probably the hardest application of that Jesus wisdom that I can think of.
Wow, my heart just skipped a little bit when you said that. That's powerful stuff.
And so I think that that's actually what we need, even though it sounds crazy. It sounds incredibly hard to do, and I don't think that most of us are in the mood for this right now, especially, I was going to say especially liberals, but I don't think conservatives are either.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm almost like chicken to say this anymore, but at the same time, it's exactly what we need.
Yeah.
Now, when I say that, I want to be really clear. I think you already know this, but when we talk about love in this context, it's not an emotion, it's not a feeling, it's not some affection. It's a different kind of love.
Right.
That has to do with our regard for our fellow human beings, our commitment to them, our wanting the best for them, these kinds of things.
Right.
Hey, strike up the band Boston. It's more than a feeling.
Wow.
And feeling doesn't really have anything to do with it because we may feel contempt, but ethically we're called to somehow have some regard for these people.
Well, it's an interesting...
And so in the chapter, I try to explore what that might look like in practice, even when it seems really difficult. And hopefully when the mood changes sufficiently, we can try to start going in that direction. But I do think it's really hard. This is probably one of those subject areas where I sound like I'm overly idealistic or naive or totally impractical. That's probably true, but it's also exactly what we need.
The world has never suffered from radical love.
Then,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I wish I felt more hopeful about it happening in the near term or even the long term. It seems like we're going in just the opposite direction right now. But if we were really able to see the humanity in our political enemies and see that truly they're not our enemies, that could be transformative and we could start to make some progress. And I know that some people are probably thinking, no way, dude, these people are racists. I'm not going to, quote, love these racists and these misogynistic assholes and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so in that chapter and in my thinking, I try to show that there's a way to hate all of that and reject all of the bad ideas and the bad actions, bad behaviors, damaging patterns without hating the person. And so my pithy way of addressing this, and it actually relates to that very familiar evangelical idea of hate the sin, love the sinner.
I was just going to bring that up, but you didn't. Yeah.
And what I say is hate the hate, love the hater.
Wow. You know, what's interesting, too, and genetics have shown us that, the human family is exactly that everybody on this planet comes from the same two people. We've been able to determine that genetically. It didn't go down quite like the Bible says. They trace it to about 175,000 years ago in the Rift Valley in Africa. So the book of Genesis gets those components wrong. But the idea that everybody on the planet literally is connected to one another in a genealogical human family is abundantly true. And so seeing one another as family can help stoke this thing. You brought up a couple of things in that I really in your last thing about Jesus and politics that I want to ask you about that can transition into your other book, The Evangelicals You Don't Know. Do you know the book? Do you know David Quo? Do you know that name?
I know the name, yeah. Wasn't he in the Bush White House?
Yeah, he was in the Bush White House. He wrote a book called Tempting Faith. He was part of that faith-based initiatives office that Bush opened up. And he wrote a book called Tempting Faith, and he wrote about how he left that job disgusted at how much, according to him, the administration, not Bush himself, but the rest of the, Cheney and several other folks in the administration were, in Quo's words, using religion and using religious people to accomplish their political agenda. And so they would bring evangelical leaders into the White House and sort of lavish all this praise and friendship on them, and then, go to your church and get people to vote for these things. And then when the leaders would leave, they'd sit around and joke about, oh, that asshole, could you believe that guy and his stupid, and kind of speak about these folks in really disparaging ways. This is according to Quo in his book. He left, and I was really interested because I was interested in the ways the right wing were misusing Jesus and misusing faith and misusing the Bible to sort of accomplish a political agenda or an economic agenda, or to help make people more intolerant of one another. And we spoke to a little bit of that, and you can maybe bring some of that up more. But what you brought up is a way that maybe the left has misused, or in a more positive way can use the example and the figure of Jesus to sort of transform our own understanding of our political relationships. And I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's such a shame that conservatives have sort of monopolized Christianity and have monopolized Jesus. I would never say that Jesus can only be seen in a liberal way.
Yeah.
I think that Jesus transcends our political labels. I have people come up to me and say, oh, yeah, Jesus was a socialist.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't deny that you could see that in him, or that there were socialistic tendencies. But I think all of our labels fail.
I would agree.
Trying to understand. They're just too specific.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't say that Jesus only belongs to liberals. But I would say that it's a shame that conservatives have had a corner on that market.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably one reason why so many younger Americans have ditched religion.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I wish that liberal political people and movements would do more to build on and invoke the Jesus idea. Hopefully not in the inappropriate ways that the right wing have done it. Hopefully in inclusive and loving ways and positive ways. There are some examples that maybe that's starting. I'm thinking about William Barber and the Moral Mondays movement.
Sojourners.
Exactly.
Yeah, those folks are really interesting.
What would be really radical would be if secular people started invoking the wisdom of Jesus in secular ways.
Yeah.
Because then I think there's a lot there, and it could be helpful. And I'm trying to get people to see that this wisdom is available and applicable wherever you are on the religious or non-religious spectrum. But I think it might be a while till that happens. But at any rate, I would like to see more, at least a balance in terms of Jesus being invoked by liberals and conservatives. And it'll be interesting to see how much of sort of a Christian left, for lack of a better term, develops. There seems to be a lot of energy right now, and based on the materials that I receive as a journalist, a lot of activity by progressive religious organizations and Christian organizations to try to resist Trump and to try to raise this compassionate Christian voice in a time that seems to be going in a very non-compassionate direction. I hope that becomes powerful.
Yeah, when you go to your Amazon page, it always says customers who bought your books also bought books by, and there's a lot of names there that people might recognize. One of them is Tony Campolo, the red letter Christian. And I don't know if you know Dr. Campolo's work, but he's a believer.
Yeah, I'm familiar with. Yep, I'm familiar with his work.
And much more conservative than you, and a believer, but tends to focus on the sort of Jesus example as well. In our last few minutes, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about the evangelicals you don't know. Can you let our audience know what that book's about?
It came out in 2013. And it was about a group of people who I like to describe as the new evangelicals in post-Christian America. When I started out writing about religion and public life, Andy, I was really focused on the Christian right and all of the bad things they were doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I became aware of your work there, and then with this book, and so it's amazing. Go ahead.
And at the same time, I was finishing up a master's program at Penn, and my professor there was really getting on me. He accused me of having an anti-evangelical bias. And so I was kind of an evangelical hater.
Wow.
And the stuff that I wrote was valid. I mean, I still stand by it. I mean, the misuse of God in politics.
Sure.
And all that stuff. But as time went on, and my being in Portland was a big factor in this, and people like Dan Merchant were big factors.
Yeah.
As time went on, I started to see a different side of evangelicalism and a different kind of evangelical. And I started following that trail, and I wrote a series of columns about what they were doing and the meaning that it would have for our politics and our culture. And it became sort of a subspecialty of mine. And then I decided that it would all add up to be a good book and a book that needed to be written. So I went ahead with that. And I'm glad I did, but it's frustrating now because even back in 2011, 2012, 2013, when I was working on the book and when it came out, these more progressive, more open, newer evangelicals were obscured by the evangelicals who were getting all the media attention.
Right.
Even though a fairly large percentage had voted for Obama in 2008. But you know what's happened since then? I feel like they've been even more obscured because all we hear about is the 81% of evangelicals who voted for Trump.
Right.
And also there's the fact that I really fear that in the 3 or 4 years that have passed since that book came out, a lot of the, quote, new evangelicals have become ex-evangelicals, at least in terms of how they identify. And so my hope that the media and the public would develop a more complex and generous understanding of evangelicals, I don't think that hope has been realized in any way, and it's kind of a hard sell right now.
Wow.
Especially because of this recent election. And I think it's shameful that so many evangelicals strongly supported Trump after we heard for many years that character mattered so much.
Right.
And who they were going to support for public office and who they were going to get behind. And so I think that...
Yeah, in the Clinton years, it was very important to them. Character matters was a bumper sticker in the Clinton era that a lot of my evangelical friends had.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Not that there was a lot of credibility left, but whatever credibility was left, I think has been shattered by this. That being said, it's still true that there are many evangelicals who don't fit that negative stereotype. And I know it's painful for them to be subjected to that. And so I wanted to tell their story, and I'm glad that I did. And I think they contribute a lot to their communities and to what's happening. Despite what's happened with the Trump phenomenon, there are still evangelicals out there fighting for social justice and humane immigration policies and humane treatment of sexual minorities And I'm happy that they're there and they deserve to be acknowledged.
There's a network of churches that have signed on to be sanctuary spaces for immigrants and stuff. There's a lot of that stuff going on. And what I love about the book, and as I said, I became aware of you in Dan's movie, and then in your writing with USA Today and other places, and then with that book. Haven't read the new one yet. But what I actually love about it is exactly what you said in the beginning of my question. You had written it kind of like you became known for being a person who wrote these pieces that were critical of evangelicalism, or at least how it was being used by certain factions of the far right. And so the fact that you were a person that had already shown your mettle to write critical pieces about the sort of misuse or overuse or extension of political ties into certain evangelical threads, I think just raised your credibility when you turned to now say something positive about it. You know what I mean? Because you'd already shown that you were able to criticize it in significant ways. And so writing something
that makes sense to me.
Also something that and what fascinated me about this book, and a lot of you got a lot of positive press for this, and people talked about how you were challenging a lot of misconceptions that people have about these figures, about these people in these movements. And one quote I read said that you were really pointing to something new and complex and subtle that was going on. So I wonder, if you can speak to that a little bit. And do you think that's entirely died out? Like what new and complex and subtle thing did you see going on with these new evangelicals?
The fact that they did not fit the political stereotypes, and that to use really simple terms, they were doing a lot of good.
Yeah.
And when you were around them, you could see that they were good people with good hearts. Mm-hmm. And you could see, too, the sincerity of their beliefs, that Jesus really mattered to them and that God was real to them. And even though I didn't share those beliefs, I could see that it mattered a lot to them. And I felt like for me to be a good person, I had to honor that. I had to honor that in them. And for me to be a fair-minded journalist, I had to tell that story, as well as the other stories that came more easily to me, which were the negative ones. I think what I'm most proud of in that work is that I was willing to criticize my own side and challenge my own side.
Yeah.
Which can be a slightly unnerving thing to do. I mean, for the evangelicals, you don't know. I went to a place that many would see as the sort of the home base of the enemy. I made this trip to focus on the family.
Oh wow! To do a
sit down with Jim Daly, who had replaced James Dobson.
Yeah.
And it wasn't to grill him with hard questions, even though I did ask him some hard questions, but it was also to say some things to him that were sort of confessional about ways in which he and his organization had been unfairly caricatured by my side of the argument.
Wow.
And, I sort of apologized for that. And I felt that was a good thing to do, and I felt it was good material for the book, and I'm glad I did it. I was really worried I was going to be raked over the coals for doing that too. And some people did do that. They thought that what I did was unforgivable because Focus on the Family was the enemy.
Right.
And at that point, they still didn't support gay marriage. They still don't support it.
Right.
And if you don't support gay marriage, you are the enemy. And so I was consorting with the enemy and strengthening the enemy. I mean, maybe I'd feel the same way if I was gay and I'd been abused by right-wing Christians.
Sure.
And so, I accept the hit. But I think there's something valuable in being willing to criticize ourselves and be vulnerable and to criticize our own side.
Yeah.
And hopefully I showed that in a helpful way with that book. And the idealist in me hopes that eventually that kind of thing catches on.
We ratchet down the hate dialogue and this emphasis of what divides us. It's what I really appreciate about the work you're doing and what a guy like Dan Merchant did as well with his film. But with this book and with both books really, but with the evangelicals you don't know, I found that message to be a really important one. I'm wondering. I have a friend who we had on the show recently, a guy named John Voles, who's a pastor in California, and he was also in Jackson, Michigan for a while, and he's exactly one of these kind of people. He's a guy that just gets up every morning and he just says, where's God doing work and how do I get involved in it? And it's not so much about winning people over to the church. I mean, sure, that's what he would like, and he would like people to know this Jesus that he knows, but they would just go, they found an organization that worked with kids in the area who had experienced some kind of trauma, and the kids had written poems about it. This was not a religious organization. This is at like one of the schools, and he got a group of musicians together to write songs to put music to the poems, and then they like brought the whole town together and performed these kids' poems about the trauma. Like a kid would have a parent in jail for drug addiction or, you know, committed a crime or something, and, you know, third and fourth graders, and they would do these sort of transformative events for the community just because, like, not, you didn't even have to come to the church to do it. They would just go to a coffee shop or a bar. He instituted like, you know, doing music hours at local bars and stuff, and took a lot of shit from folks that were like, Christians shouldn't be at the bar, you know, yada yada. But I really see him as one of the very people you're talking about, and it's a whole different ball game when you get around these people. They really do speak to the kind of thing you're talking about, this kind of new and complex and subtle thing going on. The guy's just bubbling over with a kind of passion to serve people that's very difficult to say nuh-uh to be against.
I agree. It's very disarming. It can be inspiring. You know, you're lucky to be in Portland, because I found that Portland is a real epicenter for that kind of evangelical voice and that kind of evangelical presence. And it's interesting because Portland is also a very unchurched city.
Yes.
So somebody might think, well, you know, secular Portland, liberal Portland, that would be the last place,
right,
where evangelicals would be at their best. But I actually think the two things go together. I think it's way more than a coincidence that secular Portland is also a site of evangelical excellence and innovation.
Fascinating.
And I think that evangelicals have to be at the top of their game in a place like Portland, unlike some place that's deep in the Bible Belt. They have to come up with something new and credible and relatable that goes well beyond sort of Christian subculture. And so I think that kind of context is really good for Christians and good for Christianity. And that's often when Christianity is at its best, when it's in a culturally non-dominant position.
Wow, well said. Well, as we wrap up here, just two questions for you, really. What are you working on now? You know, what's on the horizon? You're doing this work at Yale, and what are you guys working on there? But so you mentioned the Yale humanist community. Yep,
I'm very involved in the Yale humanist community, which is only about 3 or 4 years old.
Great.
It's emblematic of what's happening around the country with these humanist chaplaincies popping up at more and more universities and in more and more communities.
Congratulations.
Yep. With my writing, I'm trying to become more of a voice within humanism and trying to further this shift toward a positive articulation of secular lives. It's fascinating to be at Yale Divinity School, which is my main job.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, a place that represents many good things about Christianity. Obviously, you know, being at Yale, it's a site of academic and intellectual excellence. Most of the students and faculty here are Christians, and it's a pleasure to be around them and see their faith practice and the kind of warm community. I really think that if this is how Christianity was uniformly, it wouldn't be going through the decline that it has.
Fascinating.
Because they really do a good job of it here, and you know, I'm part of the school. I'm not part of their faith practice, but it's a really good place to be, and it's encouraging to see this form of Christianity at its best. But like all seminaries and like all religious institutions and religiously affiliated institutions, there are challenges. People here know that the demographics are shifting, and the generally mainline churches that the school serves are shrinking, and there are fewer pastor jobs for the people who graduate from here. So it's also a challenging time for Christian divinity schools, even those that have the good fortune of being at schools like Yale.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, you know, I mentioned that you wrote for USA Today because that's where I first became aware of your work, and then, like I said, Dan's movie, and then your books. But you've also written for ESPN, The Nation, Christianity Today. You've done work with Air America. I wonder, how have you been received on Fox and Friends? I keep mentioning I'd love to see you on Bill Maher. How have your appearances gone over on the Fox network?
I was on twice when my first book came out, which was Onward Christian Athletes.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that with ESPN.
They were interested in the nexus between religion and sports, which is always so conspicuous when you're watching sports. So I was a little bit nervous about going on with Fox because, you know, the book wasn't like pro-Christianity. It wasn't in any way snarky or negative.
Right.
But I had a critique of what was going on. And so I thought they were going to rake me over the coals like, what do you have against these wonderful Christian, wholesome athletes? It was really mild. and they just asked me to talk about how big-time sports had become so conspicuously religious and why this was happening. And so it was surprisingly innocuous.
Was it
and
like an anti-Tim Tebow book, or what? What was the gist?
It was basically sort of a behind-the-scenes look at why big-time sports had become so Christianized.
Okay.
It explained how evangelical ministry organizations had been operating behind the scenes for decades, trying to turn sports into almost a marketing vehicle for their evangelism. But then I did some investigative journalism for the book and showed how most of these ministry organizations had strong ties to the Christian right and how they had an agenda that was anti-gay and anti-women and so forth, and that didn't address the real moral problems in sports.
Right.
So there was definitely a critique. But, in this 3-minute session on Fox and Friends, they didn't have time to get into that. So I'm one of the few liberals who went on Fox News twice and had a pleasant
experience to tell about it. Yeah. It'd be great to do an expose of that John 3:16 guy that was at all the football games in the 70s and 80s.
I know.
Figure out what that guy's problem was. Well, hey, Tom, thank you so much for speaking with us, man. Is there anything you want to add or say to our listeners as we close up shop here?
Just want to say thank you, Andy. It's been a delight talking with you. Thanks for the good work you do.
Oh, this is fantastic. We are in a time, I think it always feels like perilous and stressful times, but after this last election cycle, I just couldn't see a more pertinent time for your work to exist. Being a uniter, being a person whose work has been devoted to building bridges between people of these disparate and often competing and hostile ideologies, to do the work you're doing now for both people on the quote-unquote left and right. I just think everybody can learn from your work, and everybody can take a step towards each other in our common humanity and in that common quest for transcendence and purpose that we started the show talking about. So thank you so much, sir, for the work you do.
Well, I feel very encouraged by what you just said. Thank you very much, Andy.
Absolutely. Folks, you're listening to On the Block Radio. Our guest is Tom Krattenmaker. Get yourself over to our site so you can get links over to his work, the new book, Confessions of a Secular Jesus Follower, the previous works, Onward Christian Athletes, and the evangelicals you don't know about?
The evangelicals
you don't know. Right. Tom, thanks for being here, man. We really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Have a good night.
And we will see you folks on the other side.
You've been listening to On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurevich. The show is produced in Portland, Oregon by Michael DiNapoli at MD Productions. Theme music by Moving the Mountain. Closing music by Jonathan Oak. Look us up on the web at ontheblockradio.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Previous episodes can be found on our website. Thanks for listening.
New minds. They're beautiful, kitty. Looking at this world, at our lives. Oh, look at you out there. With the perspective of apocalypse, children. Beauty like a bolt, light in a darkened hallway. Standing dusty in the barren highway. Looking at this world, standing broken before the fathers who are meant to make us whole, but only lied to us about what it meant to be a man. What it meant to be a woman, but what it meant to be a child of this doomed age. Standing broken before the fathers who were meant to make us whole, only lied to us about what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman, but what it meant to be a child. This girl breathed in lightning out in the yard. It's a world of sin, slowly tearing me apart. There's a blood-warm rain running down her window pane. Oh, you beautiful kitty kitties. Oh, look at you out there. Creators of art, of history, of thought. New minds looking at this world that are alive. Beautiful, beautiful, like a bolt of lightning in your head. It keeps trying to tell you to remember that the world is a paper-thin veil over the truth. We've got our fingers in the seams. We've got our ears against the wall, listening, waiting for the voice of creation to speak our names, to call us back from the brink. It's 11:59 and counting. It's apocalypse, children. Apocalypse. She's watching her future through the red-lined windows, rests her arms on the round of her belly. I wonder if the worry in her hands and the joy in her heart will ever be one and the same. Yeah, one and the same. Yeah, one and the same. In her Apocalypse, children.